Hello and welcome to Social Media Weekly episode 24th February 2021. Social Media Weekly is brought to you by Virtual Palace Marketing, rehumanizing your marketing experience. My name is Sean. This week, Facebook removes news from Australia. In an ongoing battle between Australian government and the social media platforms, Facebook has pulled all third-party news content from all of Australia. This means Facebook users will not be able to see and share news created by other Australian publishers on their apps. In addition to that, Facebook also stated that only 4% of all content shared on its platforms are Australian news. So because it doesn't really amount to much, so Facebook was not hesitating a lot when Australia pulled that want to apply that rule onto Facebook. And Facebook just said, you know what? It doesn't cost much. We're just going to remove all of Australian news. The social giant also explained that the difference between how Google operates and how they operate, which is where Google shows search results of news sites, whether or not the news sites want it or not, which is not entirely true because websites can actually can delist themselves from Google search results if they so choose. But most of them stay listed on Google search because it helps them more than it harms them. But let's get back to Facebook's explanation. We are not talking about Google today. Well, at least not much of it. Facebook, however, said that it is a platform where publishers actively promote their content to sell subscriptions, grow readership, and increase advertising revenue. So they use Facebook as a marketing platform in order to get more conversion, whatever it may seem for whichever publisher. So this is why Facebook is a little bit different, because instead of publishers passively being shown on Google sites or on Google search results, publishers have to actively market themselves on Facebook. If this prolongs and other countries like the EU adopt Australia's new law, I can predict with confidence that Facebook and Google will start their own media companies and share their own content instead. It's not as if they can't do that. They have the capacity to do that. They have the funding to do that, and it doesn't really cost a lot to start a media company. And if they do that, then that's going to be very harmful to a lot of independent publishers around the world. So I think countries need to be very careful when they push social media giants to a corner, because they have gotten so big now that they do not take threats very lightly. Google, on the other hand, has made a deal that commits $1 billion towards the top 3 news sites in Australia, top 3 only. Because of this, the Aussie government did not force Google to sign the agreement. Based on this, it seems that Facebook made the right move by leaving Australia. The government, to be honest, isn't really interested in protecting all its publishers, but only the big ones like News Corp. So essentially, it's politics, right? So because when you be nice to the media, when the government is nice to the media, when the new election comes, the media will remember that they're being treated nicely and will in turn treat them nicely as well. So yeah. There is, however, a more recent update just released this morning. Facebook and the Australian government went into talk 2 days ago and managed to come up with a deal that satisfies Facebook. So essentially now Facebook is back. Facebook News is back in Australia. It is specifically the part that clarifies the news bargaining code, which is the Australia's this new rule that mandates all social media to pay publishers for content. Part of this code to, quote, provide further clarity to digital platforms and news media businesses about the way the code is intended to operate and strengthen the framework for ensuring news media businesses are fairly remunerated. Essentially what it means is that initially the code was a very vague and very widespread application. So it really doesn't cover specifically which areas. So it casts a really wide net, and it's so difficult to pinpoint where Facebook and Google would go wrong and where they would go right. So instead, initially Facebook actually tried to narrow down to certain specifics, but the Australian government did not want to do that. Then right after Facebook threatened to leave, well, actually left. A couple of days later, the Australian government says, okay, you know what? Let's sit down and talk about it. They narrowed down some of the fields in this rules, and Facebook says, okay, we're okay to restart this again. There is another part which also states that Facebook will be given 2 months to work out the media deals, and I would think if nothing else new comes about, I believe that in the next 2 months, Facebook will possibly go with the route of Google, where they will pay the top three publishers and, shut the Australian government up, which doesn't solve the problem because most of the publishers that are not making money are the 95% of them, right? So if you keep paying the 5% and it just makes the 5% bigger, which in the end, it's an indirect way to stifle freedom of speech because nobody will question them because they're too big and they can just easily buy out the smaller publishers, or they can choke down the smaller publishers. So where the rest of the other countries in the world can pick up on this is, I guess there needs to be a little bit more widespread support for all the publishers rather than just focusing on the top tier publishers. This is where Australia went wrong. Next up, here's what will happen if you disagree with WhatsApp's new agreement. Yes, WhatsApp's new agreement got pushed back, but it will happen whether we like it or not. It'll soon share our private information with Facebook. It was delayed to May 15, so it will still be happening. WhatsApp just explained what will happen to our apps if we don't agree with the new agreement. We have until May 15 to do this. Number one is that they will start by insisting users to read, understand, and agree with the new terms, failing which users will be able to receive calls and notifications but cannot send and make calls. Users will also not be able to read and send messages as well. So you still get calls, you cannot make calls, you have no messages, no messaging capability whatsoever. And WhatsApp did not say if those users who did not agree with the new term will have their accounts closed down or not, and how long will it happen. But WhatsApp does have a clause stating that WhatsApp has the right to close and delete all content of a user after 21 days of inactivity. The question here is, if you're still receiving and you're still receiving calls and you're still then does that mean that you're active or not active? So we can't really say, but what's going to happen is most of WhatsApp's essential features will be removed if you do not comply by May 15, and that will be a point where you need to look for a new messaging platform, or it's either you bow to them or you go find somewhere else to chat with your friends. Twitter wanted to buy Moj, an Indian TikTok clone. The deal ultimately did not materialize, and sources were adamant in keeping details of it a secret. After India's banning of TikTok last year over privacy concerns, local versions of the app began sprouting in an attempt to fill the gap. Moj, M-O-J, is one such app owned by ShareChat, which Twitter is an investor of. Although the deal between the two companies did not go through, we are now certain that TikTok is actively on the lookout for another TikTok clone. In the meantime, Twitter is also rolling out its Clubhouse clone called Spaces on a stage-by-stage basis. So it seems like what's happening now is all the social media platforms are becoming, generic, and the only difference they have is users' inability to move between platforms, because Facebook is also building a Clubhouse clone, and Facebook has a TikTok clone. Everybody has a clone of everybody else, so we're just waiting for Snapchat to come up with a TikTok clone, and everybody has everything. Clubhouse hit by privacy concerns. Just last week, a user was able to stream Clubhouse audio feeds from multiple rooms into their own third-party site, which meant that there weren't any security measures that prevented audio conversations in rooms from being siphoned out. The user has since been permanently banned, but yeah, I mean, Clubhouse doesn't ask for much from a user before you set up an account anyway, so if that account is banned, they can always create another account. And Clubhouse has also assured us that all the measures for that has been applied to safeguard against similar issues. There's also been confirmations that the budding social media company is relying on Shanghai-based startup Agora Inc. for most of its backend operations. So pair their reliance on the Chinese company with their privacy concerns of growing and their pressure and their intense pressure against Facebook and Facebook and Twitter, it seems as if Clubhouse has nothing on their side except if they were to, number one, get a massive investor like maybe SoftBank to come and put in a couple of $1 billion for them to spearhead ahead, because they have a good their product is valid, their product is sound. If Facebook wants to clone their product, that means they're doing something right. And companies like SoftBank are very aggressive to finance these kinds of startups. And they do need funding in any case, even if it's not from SoftBank, even if it's from somewhere else, and they need a lot of money because they need to compete with the likes of these tech giants. And they need to fix their security problems like ASAP. At this point, I think, according to what I heard about from the people at Clubhouse, they only have 7 staffs working in the company, which in late 90s and early 2000s case is actually a lot of people to run a startup. But at this point, social media, you cannot run at that pace anymore. So the question is, would you still like to keep using Clubhouse, assuming by default, would you still want to use Clubhouse if Facebook comes up with their own version and more people are on Facebook than on Clubhouse, because Facebook will build for Android and Clubhouse still has not have the Android version, or Twitter when Spaces is available to everybody? Or would you still be using Clubhouse because it has a sense of originality, like the leftover people who are still active on Snapchat? If you still like to use Clubhouse, you need to assume by default that all your conversations are being recorded and you are being spied on by unknown parties at all times. There is no privacy, and you need to understand that moving forward. TikTok signs deal with UFC. The multi-year deal with the UFC, which is Ultimate Fighting Championship, I think. It's an MMA competition, or an MMA, what's that called? Brand, I guess. They will offer UFC content exclusively on TikTok only, but it isn't actual fights. They are post-fight access, behind-the-scenes footage, and engagement with UFC athletes. While it isn't the best content user want to see, because we go there to actually see the fights and not what's happening before and after, but it is a good step for mainstream sports channels to work with social media to attract young viewers. This also comes at the wrong time for TikTok, as more violent content on the platform will make it harder to unshed its label, following the issue in Italy, where a 10-year-old girl died after taking part in the blackout challenge. This challenge was running rampant in TikTok, where users take videos while choking themselves. On your first reaction would be, why would someone choke themselves and take a video of it? But this isn't the first time challenges like this has happened, and this isn't the first time someone has lost their lives on these challenges. Tide Pod challenge, the blue whale, and all these kind of things, they are everywhere. And people, especially young people, would go to lengths to get some engagement. So, although UFC is a legitimate sport, it probably should apply age restriction, lest another self-harming scandal unearths. That's all for Social Media Weekly this week. Social Media Weekly podcast is available on Anchor FM, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. Our full videos are available on YouTube, and we post bits and clips on Instagram and Facebook. This is Social Media Weekly episode 24th February 2021. My name is Sean. Stay safe. See you next week. Au revoir.